Pursuant to the order of the Senate agreed to on the 24th of June 2013, the Senate will now move to valedictory statements. Now, I just remind the speakers there's no need to seek leave when you're making these. You just speak as normal.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. On the night 10.5 years ago when I gave my first speech in this place, I was unfortunate enough to have that speech coincide with the decision of the then government to go to war in Iraq, which rather deprived my speech of some attention that it deserved. Another war seems to have conspired similarly tonight. I must be cursed in some way, I suppose. Mr. President, I was pre-selected for the ACT Senate seat made vacant by Margaret Reid, retiring in late 2002 after the last sitting for that year of the Legislative Assembly. I resigned from the Assembly before its first sitting in 2003, before it had a chance to say goodbye. And so, with your indulgence, Mr. President, I will make this my valedictory from two parliaments, not one. I entered the Senate in 2003 as the 500th Australian to do so since 1901. I would have mentioned that fact in my first speech if I'd been aware of it. Obviously, I'm employing better researchers today than I did back then. I first entered this chamber with a sense of pride and of awe, but wondering how it would translate from being a big fish in the nation's smallest pond to being a small fish in its biggest. And I confess to more than a few moments of dislocation and bewilderment in those early days. Coming from a place where I'd been in charge, I found it hard to work out just how things got done up here on the Hill. In fact, it was the then Arts Minister, Senator Rod Kemp, who provided me with the breakthrough insight I needed. The National Film and Sound Archive had suddenly announced it was sending part of its function to Sydney, and I was mightily upset by this. In a rather agitated state, I rang Rod and said, "Mate, this is just dreadful. What can we do about this?" He responded by saying calmly, "Well, Gary, you're the local member. If you don't like it, it's not going to happen." I put down the phone and thought, well, that's how you get things done. You throw a tantrum. Getting things done is, of course, Mr. President, the business of politics. Every one of us blessed with the honour of holding a seat in Parliament knows that the honour comes with a responsibility. We need to make a difference with the time that we are granted. Change in the world around us is inevitable, and the rate of change seems to have accelerated in the 24 years I've served in these two parliaments. Managing this change, ensuring that it best serves the people we're elected to look after, is a deep responsibility. The biggest change this community of Canberra has had to deal with perhaps has been the advent of self-government back in 1989. The citizens of this territory were quite determined that they would not be detached from the teat of a bountiful Commonwealth, and when they were, they expressed their disgust in no uncertain terms at the inaugural election of that year. The major parties managed to scrape just 9 seats between them out of an assembly of 17, and a period of uncertainty and 2 changes of government in less than 3 years followed. It was a strange experience to enter a parliament that most citizens didn't want, and so began the long, slow grind of persuading a reluctant population that it was actually better to have a local person deciding which potholes would be filled and which bus route would be diverted than a person who flew in each week from Melbourne or Hobart. That was a real baptism of fire for a 30-year-old newbie politician. After being a salesman for self-government, work choices was a cinch. The responsibilities I was given in successive ACT governments were extraordinarily broad, since everybody in the phone box government necessary in a boutique parliament has to wear a lot of hats. I personally wore just about every hat there was to wear. I particularly enjoyed the challenge of being the Territory's Attorney-General for 5 years. But for a man who had always got his wife to do the annual tax returns, the prospect of being appointed Treasurer in 1999 was the most daunting. The role appealed more to my children than to me. When the Chief Minister told me about her intention, I went home into my then 6-year-old son Felix's bedroom to tell him about what the Chief Minister was about to do and how I was about to become the Treasurer. He sat up in bed, his eyes as wide as saucers, and asked, "Daddy, you going to be a pirate?" I thought, perceptive kid, very perceptive kid I had there at that age. Representing the ACT at both levels of government has been a challenge and a privilege. I make no bones about it. This is a special community. This is the Australian treasure house. The great national institutions around us are the repository of the things that describe the achievements, the aspirations, the challenges and the uniqueness of the Australian experience. And the community in which they are set is highly educated, has a high disposable income, is highly politically literate and has a social conscience. And I wouldn't have it any other way, Mr President. What a glorious privilege it has been to be a parliamentary guardian of this community set in the bush, the largest inland city in the nation, a place which in significant respects has lived up to the ambition Lord Denman described for it in 1913 when he hoped it would be the city beautiful of our dreams. I was appointed to the Senate just days after a hellish bushfire burnt through Canberra, destroying 500 homes and killing 4 people. The city without a soul, so-called, bared at that moment a beating heart to the rest of the nation, as we suffered together and reached out to those who had lost so much. Now, 10 years later, this same city proudly celebrates its centenary. I know Canberra baiting is a national sport, but amid the send-ups and jibes, let none of us forget how much of our past and our future as a nation is tied to this city's destiny. As far as our past is concerned, I remind my colleagues in the Liberal Party in particular that we are the party which overwhelmingly has shaped the Canberra of today. The 3 greatest builders of this city were, in order, Bob Menzies, John Howard and Malcolm Fraser. Go to the roof of this building and look out across the landscape, and what you will see is an almost uninterrupted vista of projects and institutions initiated by Liberal national governments. To run down Canberra is to sell short the proud legacy of this side of the chamber. Menzies, the greatest Liberal of all, was passionate about Canberra and accelerated the relocation of some 5,000 public servants and their departments, such as Defence, from places like Melbourne to Canberra. Canberra's population grew from 28,000 in 1954 to 93,000 by the time Menzies retired in 1966. Canberra is pivotal to the future we make for our nation. Central to that proposition is the Australian public service. No less than any minerals sitting in the ground, no less than any produce weaned from the land, the APS is an asset owned by and of enormous value to the Australian people. It is the vehicle through which every national government since Federation has delivered on its promises and will again be central to the great changes we in the Coalition will need to effect if we are honoured with the privilege of government after September, as those of my colleagues in this place who have been ministers before know full well. The APS was a trusted and professional partner when Coalition governments of the past delivered the Colombo Plan, state aid to non-government schools, the ANZUS and CETO treaty agreements, the Medicare safety net and the Work for the Dole scheme. This is not to deny, Mr President, that a Coalition government should and will find savings, including by reducing the size of the Commonwealth payroll. That is, without any shadow of doubt, an essential step in restoring the budget surpluses which will be the vehicle to deliver on our national ambitions. I argue merely that quality should not be sacrificed when quantity is cut. I spoke about the responsibility we all have in politics to make a difference with the time that we are granted. I recently asked myself what difference I've made with my time. There was, in the early days of ACT self-government, so much to be done. I'm proud to point to a number of things which I, as a minister, initiated and obtained recurrent funding for in the Territory. the ACT Hospice, the Tuggeranong Arts Centre, the consolidation of the city's two major public hospitals onto one site, allowing for a teaching hospital to be developed, nation-leading defamation laws, the Territory's first 24-hour mental health crisis service, the city's first birthing centre, and many others. I am proud, however, perhaps most particularly, of the Snowy Hydro South Care helicopter rescue service, perhaps because everyone said it would never happen, particularly the public servants who were supposed to be making it happen. There's no record of how many lives this service has saved in the last 14 years of its existence. At the federal level, achievements for those who are not ministers are more fine-grained and collegiate. Two such achievements stand out. I put my shoulder to the wheel with other senators during the inquiry into mental health in 2006 and various inquiries into children in institutional care, leading respectively to a blossoming of new mental health services in 2006 and the apology to the forgotten Australians in 2009. Seminal achievements, I believe, of the last decade. I hope that my contribution to development of coalition policies for this year's election will lead to other achievements, albeit ones that others will deliver. I'm proud to have been part of this great chamber of review for this past decade, and I've tried to uphold its best traditions and advocate for its relevance and purpose. One of the weapons used against me in the recent ACT Senate pre-selection was that I had crossed the floor to vote against the party, the implication being that by doing so I wasn't quite an authentic Liberal. Can I take this opportunity tonight to remind my party that the ability of its members to cross the floor, to defend the primacy of their conscience and judgment, occasionally, against the dictates of the whip's call, is a practice that defines liberalism in this country and sets it apart from the Labor Party. Sometimes we need to stand up for a higher principle, and our ability to do so underscores that essentially Liberal MPs and senators are the products of their communities, not of a party machine, and that this device is a strength, not a weakness. Although I was the only Liberal senator to cross the floor in the life of the Howard government, I'm pleased to say that I have led something of a revival of the tradition in subsequent days. A trendsetter, if you like. And that even as late as this week, some of our colleagues have taken the opportunity to exercise that very important right. And I remind all of us, Mr President, that none of them are less a Liberal for having done so. Yeah. In any case, I think I have enough brownie points to warrant some indulgence. I roughly estimate that over the last 24 years I have voted in divisions and on the voices, in accordance with the Whip's direction, approximately 55,272 times. Now that's a lot of loyalty. It's a lot of loyalty. I have a perfect attendance record in the Senate. I've never missed a day of a Senate sitting, and I've only ever missed one division in this place in 10 and a half years. OK, it was for the sale of Telstra, I admit. It was for the sale of Telstra, but nobody's perfect. I am and always have been a Liberal to the core. I have for more than 3 decades been investing in an enduring message, not a slogan, but a conviction, that the Liberal way is about creating communities that are stronger, more prosperous and more secure, and that this message has a relevance at every level of Australian government. That investment has paid dividends. I'm proud, for example, that former Gary Humphries staffers now sit in 3 Australian parliaments, with more yet to come. There are many tonight I need to thank. So many have lighted my way or lightened my load. I acknowledge my predecessor, Margaret Reid, who's here tonight, the first woman to be President of the Senate, who was a paragon of hard work and dignity. I acknowledge Amanda Vanstone, who first brought me to the Senate as a staff member and who taught me the value of a sense of humour in politics. My predecessor as Chief Minister, Kate Carnell, is also here tonight. She was an extraordinary woman to work with, an exceptional person in so many ways. I have never seen a more courageous politician, a compliment meant only slightly in the yes minister sense. My little place in history is secured by having served as Deputy Leader to the first and so far the only woman to head a Liberal government in Australia. I pay tribute to those who served as my ministers in the brief but glorious Camelot that was the Humphries government. I don't know why you're laughing, but I think you're on side. The Territory has been exceptionally lucky to find many fine ministers in each administration, despite the ridiculously small gene pool from which they are drawn. My time here in the Federal Parliament has been enriched by the privilege of working with some exceptional people. Attempting to pick out all of those people would be sheer foolishness, but allow me to mention a few. To the 4 shadow ministers I've served as Shadow Parliamentary Secretary, Scott Morrison and Kevin Andrews, and more recently George Brandis and David Johnson, I pay tribute. These men will, I feel, be called on to play great roles in the affairs of our country in the near future, and they have the heart and character to carry off that great responsibility. I also acknowledge Luke Hartsucker, who I represent in this chamber on matters youthful and sporty. Heart and character lie thick on the ground in this Senate. It has been an extraordinary experience to serve with the remarkable period who make up this place. I single out only one for mention tonight, and only because he's about to bail out of it, Barnaby Joyce. In the version of this speech I saved last night before going home, I was going to say that Barnaby is about to attempt the political equivalent of Daniel Craig leaping from a speeding Bentley and landing on a moving train. I've had to modify that simile slightly as a result of today's events. Perhaps it's more a case of stepping off a stationary train onto a platform now. Barnaby. I hope I haven't jinxed you, Barnaby. I'm sorry. I put on record my thanks to the Leader of the Opposition, Tony Abbott, for his loyalty and support during my recent pre-selection battle. On the day in 2009 the Liberal Party elected Tony Abbott as its leader, I thought it had made a serious mistake. Today I see in Tony Abbott a man ready in every way to lead this nation, and who will confound his critics to make a fine Prime Minister. The people who power this building and keep it running smoothly, despite the politicians, are owed a great deal by all of us. The gracious Senate attendants, the cheeky security staff, the omnicognizant procedural officers, the Hansard staff who practice the dark art of turning our gobbledygook into statesmanlike addresses, the drivers who are always the first to know, I thank them all most sincerely. I've been blessed by truly exceptional staff members of my own over those 24 years. I was inspired years ago by the American movie Dave to always choose staff who, if I fell into a coma, would do my job in the interim better than I could. My present staff fall very much into this mould: Danielle, Pat, Cam, Jules, and above all, the indefatigable Ross. I owe them and all who sail with me over the years, and there are more than a few in the gallery tonight, more than I can say. I hope your talents and loyalty are not lost to the Liberal Party. Of my former staff, I need particularly to thank Rowan Greenland and Stephen Forshaw for outstanding service. My family has shared this journey with me every step of the way. My wife married a politician and my sons were born to a politician. In fact, Cathy has trod these halls and those of the old Parliament House for longer than I have. I thank her for a wise counsel and unfailing support. To my sons, Felix and Owen, thank you for standing up for me, even when I missed so much of your growing up because of the job that I did. I wish Tony Abbott and my party colleagues the best of luck at the coming election. I will take this opportunity, however, to offer some advice to my colleagues in the event they are favoured by the Australian people with the privilege of government later this year. As the only person on this side of the chamber to have actually led a government, there are 3 on the other side of the parliament, but only me on this side, I think I'm entitled to offer a little advice. Set yourselves sensible, nation-building goals in government, worthy of the best traditions of the coalition, but not beholden to the values of a former age. Having chosen those goals, stick to them. Talk about them with passion. Let the Australian people never fail to associate you with those goals. They may not always share those goals, but they will give you credit for having convictions that don't crumble in the face of an adverse opinion poll. Listen carefully to the voices of those affected by those goals, remembering that in such exchanges there is sometimes no voice for the greater public interest. Above all, take full and careful stock of the cold, hard evidence in all its comfortless ugliness. A government that continually skips that stage of the process, relying on instead of hunches and focus groups, is destined for grief. Calibrate your actions not by the next news poll, but by what historians will say about those actions. After a period in office, measure success or failure by whether, objectively speaking, Australians have more control over their lives, whether more of what they earn stays in their pocket, whether they have more chance of building something or producing something or achieving something worthwhile than they had before you came along, and whether they are more hopeful about their future. In that process, however, remember that there are many Australians who will never have effective control over their lives. Ensure they too have a respectable share of the choices this great and wealthy nation confers on its citizens. Mr President, I thank you, my Senate colleagues, the visitors from the other place have obviously just gone to something much more important, and the many family and friends who travelled here tonight to be with me and my family on this special night. I thank particularly the many members of the ACT division of the Liberal Party who are present here tonight. Of course, if you'd been here on the night of my pre-selection, I mightn't have been giving my valedictory speech tonight. But que sera, sera. I thank you all for your loyalty and support of me over a long career, and it would not have been possible without that affection and support from a party and a community which has obviously shared so many steps along the way. Thank you.